Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this month's installment of Democracy and Venerability in partnership with the Venda Museum, the Thomas Mann House, and Dub Lab Radio. It's somehow our last interview of the year, and we're so happy that all of you are here, be it with us on Zoom or listening on air. 2024 has brought both the members of the Student Council and our dedicated listeners a series of thought-provoking and inspiring discussions about the various vulnerabilities facing our democracy today. Though it's hard to believe that this is the end of the Democracy and Vulnerability series, we are so lucky to have Sharon Dodua Otoo to help round out the year. My name is Emma Larson, and I, along with the rest of the Student Council, are so excited to welcome you, Sharon, as today's interviewee. Currently the Honorary Fellow at the Thomas Mann House's Villa Aurora, Sharon grew up in Ilford, London, before spending a year in Hanover, Germany, where, as a 20-year-old, she developed a deep interest in the German language. After studying German at university and moving to Berlin in 2006, Sharon began writing and publishing short stories and novella. Her German language Herr Gottrop Sat Down won the prestigious Ingeborg Bachmann Prize in 2016. And her first novel, Ada's Room, was published in 2021 and has since been translated into several different languages, including 2 English language versions. Sharon's written works, encompassing magical realism, Afrofuturism, identity issues, and the perennial search for individual empowerment, speak to the kind of issues that Sharon addresses in her activism. She's politically engaged with a range of registered associations, including Initiative Black People in Germany, Phoenix, the Coalition for Pluralistic Public Discourse, and the Black queer feminist organization ADEFRA. Since 2022, Sharon has been curating the Black German Language Literature Festival, Resonances. Today's program is going to feature a 1-hour discussion with Sharon, moderated by Student Council member Matthew Jones. I, along with Council member Elsa Cooney, will also be posing questions as we work together to think about how Sharon's creative work and activism can help us all make sense of how we may work together to make our democracies even a little bit less vulnerable. On behalf of the entire Student Council, Sharon, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We
Thank you
also
so much.
extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Venda. Matt, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma. It's lovely to have everybody here again, and so grateful to spend this last super special conversation with you, Sharon. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to get things started because we have a limited amount of time with a couple questions that'll help us get to know you, your work, and sort of the contexts in which you're doing your work. So I'm going to actually throw it right back to Emma, who's going to get us started.
Yeah, so first, hello. After I pose my question, feel free to, say, answer it in whatever way you see fit, because it's a pretty basic question. But your website and in my introduction, I described you as, quote, a novelist and political activist. And I'm curious, in your experience, what is the relationship between those two different identities, and how does your experience with one influence your experience with the other?
That's an interesting question. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to talk with you all. I feel very honored about that. So I used to have a much longer kind of strapline to introduce myself, and I would say I was a mother, activist, writer, and editor in the past. That had to do with the fact that I wasn't yet writing in a professional capacity. So it felt to me like the identities I listed in that order were the things that kind of made up my everyday life and my lived experience and really impacted on what I did and what I was able to do and like the reason for me doing. So me being a mother had a lot to do with how I could organize my work time, for example, but also thinking through, yeah, what kind of society do I want my children to grow up in and what can I actively do to influence that? So activist and writer were the next 2 roles I would put together. And it's interesting because in Germany, often I was asked, yeah, can you be an activist and a writer, or how does it influence the two? And the term activist is also often has a slightly negative touch. It kind of means that you're only pushing in one direction and everything you do is propaganda to support your activism. But I would say that's not how I understand the term. I think activism is something that many people can do or many people choose to do. And some people do it perhaps not even using that label. And to me, activism simply means that I understand that the world we live in is one in which there are great inequalities, and there is discrimination, and some people have way too much, and some people have way too little. And I can reflect on that through whatever I'm doing, whether I'm still studying through to when I'm working professionally, perhaps even if I'm retired, in any way that I engage with the world, I can reflect on these inequalities and think, how can I use the means that I have to influence that? So I thought about myself as a writer and what can I do with my writing that doesn't accept the status quo as it is, but says I can perhaps shed a light on it, or I can make transparent my particular stance on certain things. And what I try to do with my writing, what I do as a novelist is it's not so much my aim to give people information and educate them on the facts. I think I would like my readers to I would like to take my readers seriously and say, I guess that they're, mostly adults. I'm writing mostly for adults, and that they already have engaged with the world and have arrived at their points of view because of their own lived experience, because of their education, and so on. I want to take that seriously, but I would like to ask them to question maybe some of the assumptions that they've had and to think about where they're coming from, why they're coming from those perspectives, and maybe to see if they can imagine that they might think differently had they been raised in a different context, had they been living at a different historical time, had they had a different identity. So that's more what I'm going for. I'm going for thought experiments. I usually call my work a thought experiment, just to say, what would it be like if? Um, I don't know if that answers the question. I've kind of talked around and around. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for going into depth about that. And I really like your definition of activism. And I had a question about something kind of similar. You talk a lot about representation in literature throughout your work and your activism. So I'm wondering, because Germany is kind of known for being a land of really famous philosophers and writers. But I'm wondering how have you seen the political and social landscape of Black authors transform in Germany, and also what progress is there still to be made?
Yeah. So I would have a lot to say to that. Clearly, you might be able to hear that I was born and raised in London. I come from the UK context. And there are some big differences between the UK and Germany. One of them being that in the UK, there was a kind of inherent understanding that there were many people who lived in the UK who weren't white, but who still belonged to the UK, who still had, it wasn't questioned that they were born and raised there and would speak English as their first language. Whereas parallel to Germany, there was, for many people who were my age, for example, who also were born and raised in Germany and only speak German as their first language, they constantly were growing up with a questioning if they were really German simply because they were not white. So that was something that I wasn't confronted with, particularly as a youngster, whereas many of my Black German peers would have constantly been living through that. So part of my work in the German context is thinking through these assumptions about who is deemed to be German, who can walk down the street and, just be fitting seamlessly into the landscape, and who might be questioned at any given turn by the police, for example, and asked to show their identity papers. And it's really tragic that this happens. And it's even more tragic. No, that's not true. It's tragic that it happens, and it's equally as tragic, I would say, that people question if that's true, and question these lived experiences. So part of my work with the literature is to say it's also a very, very German experience to be living in a place where people don't accept you straight away as German. That's also part of Germany. And I try to put that into my writing, as I said at the beginning, not as a means of educating people about it, but really saying, look, this cannot be taken for granted. And I think identity is very fragile as well, and very dependent on, yeah, how can I put this? It's like I'm a Black person because I live in a place where the majority are white, and then there's something slightly different, and then someone puts a name on that. There are many people who, for example, like my parents who grew up in Ghana, who didn't have a use for the vocabulary Black. That wasn't a thing that they needed. They would have described themselves in different ways. They would have called themselves Ga, for example, because that's the ethnic group they belong to. So thinking through these things, it's not just saying, people are Black as an essential, but they're Black because it's a sliding scale, if you like. These are the kinds of things I like to think out loud about with my literature.
Thinking about, I mean, you brought up being born in London, and then I mentioned that you moved to Germany and obviously live there now and do a lot of your writing in German. But I'm curious, kind of, what made you decide to stay in Germany?
Yeah.
If your experience of being Black in Germany seems to have been, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but more hostile.
Mhm.
You were more aware of your identity, perhaps. Why did you go back to Germany and then decide to dedicate so much of your life to German?
I ask myself that all the time. Um, there's a lot of different answers to that question, and I think mostly it all boils down to chance and things went one way rather than another. Sometimes I'm asked how comes I started to learn German in the first place, and my answer is a very flippant one. It just happened that way because I was relatively good at learning languages. I started learning French actually first as my first foreign language, and then because I was quite good at French, I was allowed to also add a second foreign language, and I learned German. And then I changed schools, and I liked my German teacher, and I didn't like my French teacher. That's the kind of these seemingly unimportant things actually have big consequences on your life. Now I'm a German language literary author, which is wild, I think. The reason why I ended up staying in Germany, one of the reasons is I have family, I have children who have German fathers, and I wanted my children to know Germany as, yeah, intimate places actually that they really come from and not just somewhere they visit during their summer holidays. I wanted them to understand themselves as whole people who are wholly British and wholly German. I'm not a big fan of this half-half idea. I don't think identity works that way. So, and it was also important to me that my children spoke fluent English and German. That had to do with my own personal upbringing, that my parents, as I said, both came from Ghana, but they chose not to speak their first language with us. That was, due to pressures of assimilation. I regret that. I wish I could go back in time and tell them not to worry about this sort of thing. But now here we are. So when I was raising my children, it was really important to me that they spoke German fluently. So Berlin, the capital city where we live, is a place which is really easy to get by bilingually. Lots of people speak English. You can use English pretty much all through the day. There are people who live in Germany who don't speak German and they speak English in Berlin. And so I experience it as a very easy place, a very, if for want of a better word, tolerant place for people who speak English. England is not a very easy place to learn German in. So I was like, if we stay in England, it will be really hard for them to be bilingual. I wouldn't have been able to achieve that, I think. But this is a big privilege, right? I was living at a time when Brexit wasn't a thing. I had a European passport. The British passport was still European. I could move. I literally got in my car, put some things in my boot, and drove over. That's not possible anymore. And also, it's a huge privilege to be able to speak English as the additional language. If I was speaking Arabic or Turkish or my parents' language, which is Ga, I think that wouldn't have, we would have gotten a lot more raised eyebrows. So English is very supported as a second language in Germany and seen as something prestigious, whereas other languages, I mean, maybe you can also get away with the French and Spanish, but apart from that, it's not really seen as any kind of benefit to be able to speak these additional languages. And then a final thing I think is worth mentioning why I stayed in Germany. I think there is something around the feelings of belonging, wanting to belong to a place and not really belonging to a place. And I grew up in the UK and always felt that there was something there that was suggesting I didn't really belong. Although I've mentioned that in the UK, I wasn't questioned all the time about whether or not I was really British, and no one asked how comes I spoke such good English. That didn't happen. But there was still something in it for me when I was growing up. You know, I didn't see any Black female politicians or any Black politicians. I didn't see any Black teachers. I didn't see any Black, I don't know, law enforcement officers. I had the very strong suggestion that I had a certain place, I had a certain ceiling that I could reach and no longer. And there was just there's a certain understanding. So as a writer, I didn't see myself as having a chance in, and I did write. I was always writing and trying to submit my texts to places in the UK, but it was not really seen as realistic for me to pursue a career in that. And I ended up being really kind of, I was studying at some point, I was doing a PhD and it just wasn't going well because I was kind of not really getting to develop in the way that I really wanted to. I felt like there was a limitation on how much I could really belong, let's say in the UK. And I'm living in Germany now, and I'm speaking a language that's my learnt language. And it's clear that I didn't live, I wasn't raised in Germany, and that all feels very much more honest. Like if someone says, you don't belong here, I'm like, yes, actually, I think you're right, I don't. And it sounds very flippant, but I think psychologically, dealing with that kind of exclusion was easier for me than dealing with the exclusion that I experienced in the country I was born and raised in. Everyone's on mute, I think.
You
Yeah.
know, that's no, I'm thinking about like, yeah, I mean the psychological effect of that is real, right? Where you're expected
Yeah.
already to experience some form of, slight alienation and slight difference with the culture living in, that the reality of that feels, yeah, less harsh, less targeted, less like
Yeah.
rooted in structures of oppression.
I think I'm less invested in a weird way. Like I don't feel so quite so rejected by Germany if I am rejected as I do in the UK.
For sure.
But maybe that's also not really realistic because by now I think I've lived in Germany almost as much as long as I have lived in the UK. I think
Mm.
it's about the same now. So, and I also did take on the German citizenship.
Mhm.
That was to do with Brexit. And that was kind of an emotional moment for me because to take on the German citizenship at the time, I had to somehow prove that I wasn't able to have the Ghanaian citizenship or I didn't have the Ghanaian citizenship. Now, my whole life I'd known I didn't have the Ghanaian citizenship and I had somehow not really thought that through until the German said, no, you're not allowed to have it. Then I suddenly was like, oh, I want it though. So the Germans have told me I'm not allowed to have it. And the only way that you can prove that you don't have something, it's a philosophical conundrum, is I had to actually apply for the Ghanaian citizenship and then turn it down. It was so horrible.
Oh my gosh.
It was really horrible. Yeah. So I went through this weird thing where I was getting the German citizenship, which I was really like lukewarm about. I like living in Germany. I love Berlin. I'm a big fan of many things, but I didn't necessarily need to have the citizenship. I feel like I belong there anyway. Like I speak the language, I earn money, I pay taxes, all that kind of thing. But when I realized that because of Brexit, it could be that I wouldn't be able to move freely around Europe anymore, then I had to find a solution. And then this added layer of finding out I could have had the Ghanaian citizenship the whole time, but I now have to give it up.
Mm.
It wasn't nice.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. Yeah, just the layers of that.
The
I
layers.
think, yeah, it dovetails nicely in kind of the next section that we want to move into, which is the problems and the promises that arise from trying to have these sorts of conversations about notions of race, structures of race, but also, social justice issues and, creating better futures across contexts where in some senses you're sharing so many elements of lived experience and identity with other people, but also there's all of these other differences from language and, just state history and all these sorts of things. So I think we're gonna move into a couple questions around those themes, and I think Emma's gonna kick us off
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, so I have a question about language, and I just wanted to say I love your answer of like, you learned German because it just kind of
It
happened.
just,
Like I study early Soviet Kazakhstan, and like a decision that I kind of randomly made sophomore year of college now dictates my entire life, which
right?
it's just
Yeah,
weird how things like that happen.
yeah.
But because I spend so much of my time thinking in different languages, I wanted to ask a question about the role that language and translation plays in your work. So, your initially German language book, Ada's Raum,
Yes,
yeah, so it was translated two different ways into English. One,
yeah,
Ada's Raum, and one, Room instead
yeah.
of Realm. And I don't know how involved you were in the translations, but I'm just curious, what is your relationship to your work being translated, especially
Mhm.
translated into a language that you speak?
Yeah,
And kind of what are the differences between those two translations of the text's title?
yeah. It's a very surreal experience, right? And I have to give a shout out at this point to the translator. His name is John Chopolitzi. He's from the States. And yeah, I think he was very brave to agree to do it. And I need to say something about translation, because I was often asked if I would translate the book myself, which could have been the obvious thing, right? Because I wrote the book, so I ostensibly know it the best, and translating it into my first language would have been a no-brainer, I guess, for many people. But the thing is, I think translators are often underrated because the work of translating is actually a real skill. And I claim I'm not that good at it. I think I can translate a shopping list maybe, but like, literature and poetry and this kind of thing, that's a whole different ball game. And I think in the past, when I've tried to translate things, they come out sounding very literal. I feel like I work well in one language and I work well in a completely different thing. But trying to make a link between the two, the languages bleed into each other and neither sounds very good. That's how that's, yeah, I've just given up trying to do that. And then the other thing that would have been extremely frustrating was writing in German. There's a certain gap that I experience because the language isn't my first language. So I've learned it and I've got a feel for it, but I would describe it a little bit like I once described it as using a smartphone while I'm still wearing gloves. Like it's just, I can kind of do something, but it's hard. And I don't have the feel for the language that somebody had when they were raised in that language and they got all the nuances and the references to whatever nursery rhymes, childhood games, early TV programs, and whatever happened in the news back in the day. All of that is not accessible to me or not immediately accessible to me. So my feel for the language is slightly different. Therefore, when I'm writing in German, I don't necessarily, it sounds weird, but I don't necessarily know exactly what I've written. Not really. Or I don't know what it's doing to the person who's reading it. That's probably more accurate. And I have a different feeling for English. For English, I'm pretty sure that if I write this word in this way, in this context, the person reading it will understand it the way I meant it. Whereas with German, there's a slight gap. So now if I try to translate what I've written in German, what can happen is that I'll find out that I wrote something that I didn't mean to write. And that's really heartbreaking. So I protected myself from that experience. And also, it takes me a long time. It takes me a long time to write anyway, and then to translate would have taken me even longer because then the text will slightly change. I'll have to find a solution for something that in German didn't arise as a problem. So, for example, the word Raum in German has many different meanings. It ostensibly means room. That's the kind of the meaning you'll go to first. But if you read my novel, you begin to understand, oh, I could be referring to space, like safer space, but also like traveling to space, um, and taking up space. And it takes on different dimensions that I really like. And I want the reader to come to slowly. But in English, I have to find something because there isn't that word straight away. So that's why John actually suggested realm as a translation for Raum, which isn't the first idea that most people would have. Um, incidentally, they had to do that with all languages, all different languages. They had to find a solution. So in Italian, it's called a room for Ada. In Netherlands, it's called Ada's Place. And then, yeah, other things like this. It's really fascinating. And I think the subject of translation is really fascinating. And I just think I wanted to make sure that I didn't contribute to this idea that, oh, translation, anyone can do that. Just open up Google Translate and there you go. It's much, much more complicated than that. So yeah. I'm super grateful though that there are translators because I think translators do an excellent job of not only making a text accessible to people, but they also try to translate a whole cultural cosmos into this new language and make the cultural cosmos accessible to people. Yeah.
Have you
Sorry,
found
I just
similar?
wanted
Oh,
to,
sorry, you go, you go.
sorry, jump in before we move on because that resonated with me a lot. And I have the German citizenship and I'm fluent, but there's something so frustrating about knowing a language well enough to speak it and understand it and be familiar with it, but knowing that you'll never experience that language in the way that somebody who grew up and learned it from childhood and lived in that country and knows like the cultural and social nuances and implications
Sure.
of that language. And I found that when I would write too in German, never really creative things, but basically essays where I would be looking for one word or realize
Yeah.
that the sentence structure just didn't, it made grammatical sense, but it wasn't right. Like, and I just couldn't figure out like what was wrong with it because I didn't have this intuitive, like
Yeah.
German linguistic feeling. So yeah, that totally resonated with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just that image you have of using a smartphone with gloves
Mhm.
resonates so much. Yeah, I can translate into Spanish pretty well, but it's the same deal where it just feels so. Uh, the words I end up using tend to be more kind of blunt and forceful
Yeah.
and clumsier, and it's there's something liberating about kind of just having to choose more simplistic and less nuanced words, but it can lose so much. Have you experienced similar difficulties in terms of like translation and intercontextual communication with your work on, like you've mentioned in some of your interviews that you've had conferences or meetings of various Black intellectuals or writers or activists from different countries, all getting together to ostensibly talk about, you know, uh, dismantling systems of white supremacy or discussing just racialized minority experience or artistic collaboration. And these are all such high stakes conversations, but with artists coming from so many different contexts, what it means to be Black in America is really different than what it means to be Black in Germany versus what it means to be Black in the UK. Have you found a way to sort of help make these conversations more productive or with fewer miscommunications, or is that just a part of the process? Like as we talk about things like helping to protect a vulnerable democracy with people from around the globe, I think we're going to come up against similar, experiences of talking
Yeah.
past each other. And I'm just curious, what are ways that you found to minimize that?
Yeah. That's a good question. I'm gonna say there are definitely no easy answers. There's no quick fixes or go-tos, and if you do this, then everything was gonna be all right. Otherwise, maybe, yeah, certain wars wouldn't be happening, right? Um, I think it's in my experience, everything should have as much time. We should bring as much time as we can to a process as possible. And I think we shouldn't underestimate emotions in the process. So often when we talk in these rooms, we're very intellectual and we're thinking about facts and we're thinking about historical sequences and what happened when. But these are actually very emotional subjects. And I miss sometimes, not only in so safer state spaces or braver spaces, but also just in general when talking about political issues and democracy and such. I miss sometimes space where we can kind of be sad and mourn maybe loss or be angry, but give that a place. Like people often get angry but try to hide it or downplay it. But like of course we should be angry. Like, of course we should be angry. And sometimes it would be my wish that we would lean more into those emotions and give each other grace for those. Yeah. So that's something that does happen, I think. I'm thinking specifically right now of the group Adefra, which is a Black queer feminist organization in Germany. I've come to know that organization over the last, I don't know, since I've been in Germany, since the 90s, but I think it's existed, it's coming into its 40th year. There's two organizations that are like sister organization, which is ADEFRA, the Black Queer Feminist Organization, and then the Initiative Black People in Germany, ISD. They were created around about the same time. And I mentioned ADEFRA first because I feel ADEFRA is very good at looking at, creating spaces where people come together. And really it's about, I say 90% of the time, how are people feeling about what's going on? And there's an incredible power which comes through the ability to just listen and listen to somebody, not so that you can say, yeah, but, and not so that you can prove to them that they're wrong and try and trip them up, but just to listen, just to see where they're coming from and accept their, first of all, just accept what they're saying. And think, okay, that's valid. Okay, I need to say I'm not talking about hate crime stuff here, of course. But I think of course, our conversation can be more nuanced than that. And a lot of people are scared, frightened, and are in mourning and are suffering. And there are reasons for that. And we haven't really found space, I feel, often to talk about those things. So I think that's what these spaces do. And writers, I think, can be people who help with that because they can try to find words for emotions that are difficult to put into words. And how powerful it is when you read a piece of poetry or you listen to a song or sometimes you even see a sculpture. I saw the sculpture the other day that just completely captures a moment that you're feeling. And then with that recognition, that with that naming of your emotion or naming of how you're feeling at a given point in time, then to go into a conversation, it's a completely different level of communication than if you're just coming at it from two very, very different positions and not being able to bridge the gap. There is a danger, to come back to the very specific point about Black writers from the UK, US, Germany, maybe France, and so on. There is a danger that I understand Black as a kind of term which is like a solidaric term. It's a term of solidarity where people recognize that they have biographical ties to the African diaspora or African continent or islands, and perhaps have shared experiences, perhaps have a shared understanding of what their place in the world, often their place as in a majority white country. That's often tied in with the definition of Black. But it still doesn't mean that it's all the same. And one of the things that's been problematic in Germany has been the need to develop a language that can name specific experiences, which at the moment in German are quite difficult to name. I'll give one example. People who are born of one white parent and one Black parent in the United States, and I think in the UK as well, you might use the term mixed race to describe people like that, or biracial. In Germany, the word race is highly contested. The German translation of the word is highly contested. And I claim, I'm not trying to speak for all Black Germans here. Sorry, Black Germans, if you're in the chat. I just want to tell the way I understand the situation. I claim that the word biracial in Germany doesn't translate well. And back in the 80s, when the groups like ADEFRA and the Initiative for Black People in Germany were first being created, they were searching, the words that they had to describe themselves up until that point were coming from the animal kingdom, right? And were like mongrel or something. So they're searching for a way to use this German language that didn't actually really see them as human, but try and find a way to use this language to describe themselves. And the development of the vocabulary around Blackness was heavily influenced by the United States. Audre Lorde being one of the key figures who spent a lot of time with the Black feminist organizations, queer feminist people, and coined the term Afro-German or Afro-Deutsch, actually. And people also started to speak of Black Germans, Black Germanness. That was a very positive move. It felt very empowering for many people. And yet at the same time, there is this idea, if you're using English terms like light-skinned, dark-skinned, people of color, if you're using these English terms to describe phenomena that are happening in Germany, it can seem like, oh, actually the problem is somewhere else. It's actually a US American problem and you're just bringing it over here. That's actually, of course, not the case. And also the term people of color, as I understand it in the States, means something slightly different to what it means in Germany. Somebody might describe themselves as a person of color in the States and would not be considered a person of color in Germany. So I raise that point to say it's much, much more complex and needs more conversation than just simply taking a term and running with it. And there's some kind of danger of, cultural imperialism where, because that was the right thing to do in the States, we should do that here too. That's a little bit tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one, it's so interesting, and I love, Matt, the way that you kind of bled this conversation into the conversation before about language, but like it is about finding a common language to talk about marginalization or oppression or identity or empowerment in contexts that are so, so different. And
Yeah,
this is not a question, more just a comment, but I think
yeah,
I'm really struck by the beginning of your answer that democracies are vulnerable because it's really hard for us to listen to other people, and it's really hard for us to take emotions into consideration because emotions are scary and we're scared of
yeah,
our own emotions, so of course we're going to be scared of other people's. And I love that obviously it's way more complicated than this, but potential solution in thinking about how to build more vulnerable, more stronger democracies is to A, listen, and B, art, literature, music, poetry can be a realm to make that happen. And so I just
mm,
wanted to kind of put that formula out there because that feels tangible to me in a way that is helpful.
yeah,
And I think, the American context, obviously, we had our election last month, and like I think that things would have been different if the Democratic Party had been a little bit more willing to listen and hold space for the way that Americans were feeling. And so that just feels very, very relevant.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah. That was an incredibly different, oops, sorry about that. That was an incredibly difficult process to watch unfolding as someone who's not from the States. And, what happens in the States is going to affect so many people in the world, right? So we're not watching it with a happy distance, thinking, oh, well, look at what we're like, oh my God, what's happening? Like, and that was actually heartbreaking. I couldn't think, I mean, I know that there was a lot of time pressure. I think that was part of it, right? That Joe Biden only stepped out so late, and then there was what, 100 days or something. So yeah, but I just, yeah, I was hoping that there would be something that, so for example, in Germany at this moment in time, we don't have a government, right? There was some falling out and another group of people who didn't hold space for each other, I guess. And now the government has collapsed and is leading to us we're going to have new elections probably at the end of February. And what's happened in the States is going to heavily influence the outcome of that. And I think many people feel kind of a bit powerless, really. They're like, okay, this is inevitable that this is going to go wrong. And I would like to think through ways of fighting that feeling of resignation and, oh, this is inevitable. I mean, do you have any ideas? How did you how did you experience the run up to the elections? And yeah, how did you fight that feeling, if you had that feeling?
Badly. Emma's gonna have, I think, a really good follow-up question, kind of tying in her own experiences to this. But I
Yeah,
think for a lot of us, it was this question of there's uncertainty of what we could do and what is the best use of kind of our voices. I mean, it's interesting for me as I am a doctoral student studying comparative fascism, right? That's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and that we've even talked about in our, various other meetings that we've had. And I was constantly like, there was both this feeling of these conversations are all happening too soon. Like I haven't yet become, like I haven't gotten the doctorate yet. Like I haven't yet, finalized the expertise or whatever and been able to enter into the arena as a public intellectual. But then there's also that feeling of, but I will, and it's happening now. Like history is constantly
yeah,
happening. And always that sense of, if not now, then when, but always struggling to kind of figure out exactly what's the best use of limited time and limited agency, so to speak. But I think the current, or my basic approach was with my friends and my family and with just myself in general. The thing I kept pushing back, even policies, we couldn't really talk about, broader systemic changes, couldn't really talk about. But the thing that I felt like you could have less effect on, but the thing I constantly was talking to people about was don't dissolve into fear, or don't give yourself over to fear specifically, or despair. And then the other, because that's sort of the building block of fascism, right? Is that you become overwhelmed with a kind of fear for the future or fear of the other that ends up being able to override your other ethical concerns for people. And then the other baseline was just don't give away agency, make them
yeah,
take it from you.
yeah,
Never. So even things like voting is obviously limited and that it's not the end all be all of democracy, but still vote. Like don't give them, don't give away a tiny bit of power, you know, that you
yeah.
have. Like make them come
Voluntarily,
for it.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think that helps me even see little moments of, protecting mental health, or, just continuing to be kind and form social solidarity networks, as simple ways of not of like reclaiming agency and protecting that agency, the political power that might be more useful later on as things might get worse, probably will get worse. Um, but I think Emma has a similar a question kind of following up on that.
yeah,
Yeah, so I mean, this um, social media is a big way that people, at least I don't know about the German context, but in the US, especially of, this generation, our generation, that's where activism is happening.
Are you
And
including me in your generation?
well, no, sorry,
That's
the
lovely.
council's generation, the council's generation. Um, but and I noticed in doing research for you and looking for your social medias, you not only don't have social media, but specifically say on your website that you're currently inactive on social media.
Yeah,
I also don't really use social media and have felt pretty comfortable with that fact until recent months, where some of my really politically leftist friends started calling me out or commenting on the fact that I was not using my social media for political means.
yeah,
I personally am pretty frustrated by this idea of Instagram activism because I feel like it's very performative. It's actually not helpful. My energies feel like they could be spent elsewhere, but I'm just curious, how would you respond to people who feel committed to using social media as a politicizing force, and why have you decided to be inactive on social
yeah.
media?
Okay. There's lots in that question. I hope I remember everything. If I don't remember something, then please prod me because I have feelings about this question. The first thing I should say is I was in the past active on social media. I belong to the Facebook generation. That's how old I am. And then I use Twitter a lot. Back when Twitter had nothing to do with certain people, I really enjoyed Twitter. I learned a lot using Twitter as well, and built networks on Twitter. And a lot of my work at the time was developed through conversations I was having through Twitter as well. And then I came to Instagram quite late in the day. And I think my entry into Instagram was kind of a frustration with how things were developing on Twitter. And I was looking for a new place, but Instagram doesn't offer that, what Twitter, in its best days, Instagram doesn't offer. So that's my social media journey. The reason why I have on my website that I'm not active on social media was because I had I was this time last year I was told I had won a literature prize, and then very quickly there were newspaper articles that were published and in the media that criticized a petition I had signed a very long time ago. It was like over 7 years ago, but it suddenly surfaced that I'd signed this petition. And in the climate after the attacks in the terrorist attacks in Israel, October 7th, this signature that I'd signed, which was like a signature designed to position myself and say I would like Israel to adhere to international law, humanitarian law, something. That petition suddenly became very contentious to the point that it was being said that I shouldn't receive the prize. And a long story short, I ended up saying that I won't take the prize. That's another subject actually, but that's the background to why I stepped away from social media, because the potential for that, it was actually already a shitstorm in the media, but potential for that to also, overrun my social media was more than I was prepared to put energy into, or I didn't have any spoons for that. So what I did was I shut everything down, and I wasn't online for I think 3 months or something. And Instagram, I stayed. Yeah, I haven't been on Facebook and Twitter anyway for a long time, and Instagram would have been the one. Um, but I stayed away from Instagram for a while and then came back slowly because there were some things I was doing, a literature festival I was organizing and a film project that I had, where the people I was working with were like, "Oh, come on, you've got so many followers. We need your we need you to do some advertising for this." So I came back for those specific things, and every now and then I'll use Instagram for something. But I generally don't feel good about social media for this reason. So social media is tricky for me because I felt at the time when this shitstorm happened that I had been built up as a public figure. I hadn't asked for that. I'd been built up as a public figure. And then I had been taken down, or there was an attempt to take me down. I found that very unfair. And I thought me being on social media was contributing to this economy of, oh, I can be a public figure. And now I've said the right thing and, atoned for my sins or whatever it is. I can now be a public figure again. And I didn't want to participate in that circus. Then I find Instagram. Okay, one thing that I'd like to talk about that we haven't got time to talk about is this emotion of jealousy. I feel we never talk about jealousy, and I'd love to talk about jealousy more. And Instagram is such a jealousy producer, right? I'm looking at people on their holidays and their nice food and whatever, falling in love and all this, and it makes me feel really bad.
Wait,
And I
but you're in
think
Los
that,
Angeles now during the
yeah,
winter.
yeah,
This is perfect. Like you get to post
exactly.
sunshine when everyone else is in 10 feet of
Exactly.
snow.
You won't find
Yes,
many pictures of me
exactly.
in the sun on my Instagram. Like I kept it minimal because why? Like it's just not a nice feeling, right? So I think very intentionally about what I want to put out there because I understand the power of these images, and I'm more into doing things that feel empowering than just, promoting myself and yeah, how nice my sunglasses are or whatever it is. It's just I don't feel good about that. And then also, of course, at this current time with the very horrific things that are going on in the world, all the conflicts, famines, wars, I just feel it doesn't make sense to have these images here and then Sharon's very positive or first world problems, whatever I'm going through. I didn't like that, and I haven't figured out how to negotiate that. I'm still trying to work on that. Um, but I disagree, I think, with the leftist friends who are saying you have to position yourself on Instagram. I think I disagree with that. I think everybody has to think about their place in the world and what they can do with the means that they have. But that also includes the fact that some people will choose not to, right? That's a kind of a free will conversation. And some people don't want to or don't have the capacity to, or might have done it in the past and are taking a break or are still gathering information. Everybody has to do it in their own way at their own time. That's my opinion. And I think activism online has a place, but not everybody does that. A lot of people do stuff offline. Some people only use Instagram for personal things and do their politics. They, I don't know, volunteer in a soup kitchen or not everybody wants to advertise everything that they're doing, and that's their good right. I I'm not a fan of the call out, if you're not saying something. I empathize with it, and I also think that people who are going through extremely traumatic events, in my mind, if they're shouting and they're saying, "Oh, Sharon, we want you to do this," I take that seriously. Um, or I take it because if I were them, I'd probably know different, right? But from the position I'm in, and I think about what can I do with the means that I have, I don't choose to be posting things on Instagram about it. I choose to try and engage with it in different ways. I'm donating money. I'm trying to work it into my art and try to, yeah, in conversations and forums like this, I might talk about things, talk to people on a one-to-one basis, or if I'm invited to a reading, it would be a subject of discussion when I'm yeah, in conversations with people. Um, and I'm not going to condemn anyone for doing it, of course not, but I feel like everybody can choose to do how they do it and needs to be able to live with their conscience on that. So I wouldn't say that you should now join Instagram and start posting on these things. I wouldn't say that, but I would say be in contact with yourself and with your morals and emotions and do what you have the capacity to do. And perhaps we both need to keep checking in on ourselves. Is that still true? Or are we just being, cowards or, but that's a thing that we could do. But I think to be criticized for not speaking is part of the game. It's, we take the criticism, I guess, but we shouldn't just do stuff because people put us under pressure to do it. Yeah.
And I just want to quickly, the emotion of jealousy, you mentioned
Yeah.
that you kind of got away from it, but I think that there's something there. And like, I think, Matt, this might more be your like academic specialty, but I could even like the role that jealousy plays in the rise of fascist governments. And I do think that it's really, really tied up with a social media capitalist system where everything is itemized, everything's about how much do you have. It's a
Yes.
um, scarcity mindset instead of an
Scarcity.
abundance mindset. And so I just wanted to really come back to that and that I will be thinking about jealousy differently. And
Yeah.
I think it's an important emotion to keep in mind that you're right. We don't really talk about.
No, we do need to.
I think the way that you were framing that conversation around jealousy too, and the way that it can fuel like sort of a toxic political climate. It makes a lot of sense. And yeah, some of my work does deal with sort of the political effects of just kind of daily experience of emotions and how certain emotions become sort of, transmuted into certain kind of political actions. And what I really loved, and well, you didn't say this exactly, but there was something in your answer where almost the like what seemed to matter for you was just simply being honest about our like holding ourselves to account
Yes.
and making sure that we're honest with ourselves and not letting other people necessarily like it's one thing to be held accountable to other people, of course, but also choosing who are the people that get to hold us to account. Strangers on
Yes.
the internet are not going to be the ones, but you need to also be honest, like, am I in community that will hold me to account to be doing good in my community? Like that does
Yes.
matter. And it's about knowing which is which. And that's really hard when social media makes so many incursions into sort of our everyday life. But I think just that sort of way that you framed it was really beautiful. And I'm going to be thinking about that because I do. my one of my exams for my doctoral work is in public history. This idea that I'm theoretically a public-facing intellectual, and then I don't post on social media. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah, but there's many ways to be public, I suppose, right?
Absolutely.
And I think social media is so curated. And ostensibly we're curating. That's the thing. One of the things that I find tricky about social media is we think we're in control, right? We think we're curating our image. But because of the way the algorithm works, we're still being manipulated. Our image is still being manipulated.
Mm.
And I just, yeah, I worry about that not a great deal. Honestly, I worry about other things more. But I do think, yeah, we don't have as much agency as we think we have. Or I worry that we don't have as much agency as we think. So it seems that we're doing something. I was once accused of not doing something, not posting something, but I actually had posted it. But the way I'd done it, it wasn't completely translatable as, oh, Sharon has done this thing. And I thought, yeah, that's really symptomatic that if you don't do it in the formula, then it doesn't count. But surely it shouldn't be like that, and I'd like to think through ways of moving away from that. It's for me, it's not that important. I don't know if this makes sense, but my focus would really be on community and how we all get through, how we all survive, and not how one person showed that they were really woke and then maybe made it so that another person could get through. Like, it is important what I say, I think. I think it is important what I say. If I sat here and I said something outrageous, like, I don't know, that racism thing is over now. Black people can get jobs just like anybody else, or black people aren't being incarcerated at the same rate as, white people as much, whatever. If I said something like that, that would be super damaging, actually. And I shouldn't do that. And if I did do that, I should be held to account for saying that. But it's odd that I would have that much influence at the same. I don't know. I have that much influence and I take that seriously, but at the same time, I don't want to have that much influence because I want to be in community, and it's somehow managing that. Yeah.
It's difficult because I don't think we were meant to have our tiny limited selves extend so far, sort of
Right.
beyond
Yeah.
our control sometimes. And I do think, I mean, a lot of people have talked about one of the things that's made right-wing movements so potent this past decade is because they've been more effective in a way at weaponizing the sort of anxiety that comes from this, interconnectivity that we're experiencing now, where we're receiving too much information too quickly about too many different things. And they've kind of found their way to, set up shop there. We are
Mm.
unfortunately out of time.
Mm.
I would love to talk about so many of these other things with you because you touched on uh, just a bunch of, I think for me, the big takeaway was just the complexity of being human and inhabiting a world where all of these different contexts, all these different languages, all of these different understandings are constantly overlapping, constantly shifting, constantly moving, not just, over the internet, but with human bodies crossing borders, living in different places. And the importance then of holding space for each other, living in community with each other, and learning how to speak to each other so that our these powerful individual and collective stories don't get lost, like the ones that you're writing about, but also the ones that, the people that you're doing justice work with, the individual stories, that those are able to be amplified and heard and not simply just drowned out by all the other noise that's on the internet or coming from, various bad actors politically. So I want to thank you for being dedicated to the difficult art of storytelling, and for really, regardless of whether you wanted to be this much of a public figure, for
Yeah.
handling it with grace, and sort of demonstrating a way of maintaining that humanity, that's so essential for storytelling and that kind of beautiful activist honesty, and showing how we can kind of maintain that even in the difficulty of our voice reaching farther than maybe we thought it might. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Thank you.
thank you again for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. For those of you who are listening, thank you for being with us each of these months over the past year. It's been quite a journey. Please keep an eye out on the Venda Museum's website and the Thomas Mann House's website for what's coming next year, which is a slight change in format where the student council interviews will be live interviews that will be turned into a podcast. So just kind of changing the format a little bit. We appreciate all of your support so much, and be kind to each other, be kind to yourselves, and enjoy the next month. Thank you so much. And again, thank you again, Sharon. We wish you all the best on all of your endeavors.
Thank you.